So one of the books I've been reading, this History of Israel, from the Rise of Zionism to Our Time, by Howard Sachar. It's a pretty thick book. This is another weightlifter. Put my shoulder out trying to read it. But, well, there's a lot here, and I haven't really gotten very far. I just kind of cracked the seal on it. And, but there's a lot there. I mean, it's a history. And when I go to talk about these books, I've realized that the historical books are going to be a little bit more difficult for me to summarize, because at the risk of being historically inaccurate, I can't just give like a basic overall impression. I have to be a little bit more precise in some of the details, especially with this, because it's well, you know, whenever you're dealing with religious history, people get all weird, you know, so you gotta get it right, or people get their panties in a bunch, you know, if you don't deliver the facts in the right way. It's really hard to read this. I tried to print out my notes, and my printer, I may have printed a couple of pages, and now the printer is barely working. Okay, so this one starts out with this sort of reconvention of the Sanhedrin, brought about by Napoleon's orders. Now, the Sanhedrin was a religious council, and you would find it from back in Bible times, and it hadn't been used for centuries. And so it was this ancient body of delegates. And Napoleon had surprised not only the Jews, but the Frenchmen as well, when he ordered the revival of the Sanhedrin. Napoleon's intention was to have the Jews accept their responsibilities of citizenship in as ceremonious a manner as their tradition provided. The General Assembly had granted equality of rights for the Jews 15 years prior. France's 40,000 Jews were emancipated in 1791. The determining factor for Napoleon's decision was the rationalism of the revolution, in order to legitimize their ideology to be applied without distinction. The revolutionary government and Napoleon himself, in order to sustain their power, could no longer tolerate the ghettoized autonomy of the Jews. Additionally, I can't even read this. Additionally, the French government stood to gain from taxing some of the accrued wealth of some of these Jews. They were brought into mainstream society throughout all the territories Napoleon had conquered all over Europe, and he expected certain commitments in return. He demanded they discontinue their sense of separate nationhood. Their judicial and civil affairs would take place in French courts, to dissolve their corporative status, and certainly their traditional hope for redemption in Palestine. Members of the revived Sanhedrin affirmed their intention to cooperate and assimilate. They formally declared that rabbinical laws would be applied only to matters of religious tradition and practice. They would pledge their allegiance to France and renounce their dream of an exodus to the land of Israel. These commitments affected Jews all over Europe. There were about 500,000 Jews in Western Europe in 1807. and 750,000 in 1857. By this time, they had consolidated their rights. They were free to build homes, to travel, to conduct business, and to freely practice the professions they chose. Many believed they had liberated themselves through their own hard work. Faithful to the affirmation of the Sanhedrin, they assimilated successfully, mastering the local languages and culture. In order to protect their newfound freedom, Western Jews accepted the emerging consensus that loyalty to a national state was incompatible with pluralism in cultures. They started to drop the traditional allusions to Zion in their ritual observances. They also spoke less of the Messianic age in terms of a return to the land of Israel than of a miraculous end of days or an era of universal brotherhood. The Sanhedrin's affirmation's most substantial impact lay in the increasing sanction it provided for Western Jews to reject their historic civilization and its wider cultural and ethnic implications. Now, the Host Judaism, the 3 million Jews of Eastern Europe, represented nearly 75% of world Jewry in 1850. The largest portion were found in Russia. They comprised about 4% of the population of the Romanov Empire and were, to the Tsarist government and the native peasantry, by far the most despised and oppressed minority. They were regarded in terms of their medieval stereotype, unwelcome infidels. The government approach was to separate them from the integral Russia in a pale of settlement, which consisted of the newly annexed western provinces, an extensive territorial ghetto. They had inherited the Jews in the 18th century partitions of Poland. Even within the Pale, they were driven from sensitive border communities, restricted in their opportunities for livelihood, and denied a share in local government. Under Nicholas I, their communal self-government was abolished, and their children subjected to conversionary pressures. All this drove the Jews more tightly into their own groups and intensified their dedication to their culture. Now, these are the Jews of the East, the Jews of Russia, not the Jews of Western Europe. One of the most cherished features of the Russian Jewish cultural heritage, the memory of the ancestral homeland, the lost and lamented Zion, was enshrined in the ceremony and folklore of virtually every believing Jew. Throughout all the centuries of Jewish dispersion, Zion functioned as a binding feature in the Jewish social and religious experience. All their literature displayed a preoccupation with the Holy Land. Jewish writers all over the world expressed the yearning of the people of Israel for the ravished cradle of its nationhood. But in the West, the memory of Zion was fading by the 19th century, even being exorcised by reformers and secularists. But for Russian Jews, distraught and quarantined under the Tsars, holding tight to their accumulated sacred literature, the recollection of its loss was a visceral wound. The Jews of the Pale resisted all attempts to force the end. The Halcyonic era would signal the final redemption in the land of Israel, but much work was still to be done. It was a vision of the Jewish people transplanted to a physically restored Zion. So So this Rabbi Judah Alkali, a Sephardic preacher, published a book, Pleasant Paths. In the introduction, he alluded to the need to reestablish Jewish colonies in the Holy Land as a necessary precondition to redemption. In his later years, Alkali settled in Palestine as an example to others. One of his disciples was Simon Loeb Herzl, grandfather to Theodor Herzl, who is commonly thought of as the father of modern political Zionism. Both Herzl and Alkali favored Jewish national unity through an all-embracing organization. See, here you can see that despite what the Sanhedrin affirmed to the French government, there was now this underground movement brewing in the Jewish community. And they were basically saying, fuck that, we're going to go back. We'll take your equality and we'll assimilate, but we're going back. The religious institution had promised one thing, but there were certain believers out there who still clung to the Zionist dream. People like Rabbi Alkali, Theodor Herzl, much later Theodor Herzl, Simon Herzl, and Kalischer. Both Herzl and Alkali favored Jewish national unity through an all-embracing organization. Alkali's views aligned with a colleague, Orthodox Rabbi Z.H. Kalischer in East Prussia. He also believed in a messianic redemption in Palestine. Kalischer published his book, An Honest Faith, in 1843, and another one called The Search for Zion in 1862. His three main theses were: 1. The salvation of the Jews could take place by humanistic means of self-help, which did not require the advent of the Messiah. 2. The colonization of Palestine should be launched immediately. And 3. They were not to wait for a sign from God that they would have to take initiative and revive the sacrifices in the Holy Land. Redemption would begin with gaining support from other nations to gather their people into the Holy Land. Only once they gathered in Jerusalem would God listen to their prayers and bring about the day of redemption. Kalischer wanted to form a society of rich Jews to organize the colonization, settling Jews of all backgrounds into the Holy Land, training young Jews in self-defense. He established an agricultural school in the Holy Land called Hope of Israel in 1870. Practical Messianism. Kalischer founded the Society for the Colonization of the Land of Israel. All this happened during the heyday of mid-19th century liberalism, which inspired popular optimism for the future of Jewish immigration in Europe. The two rabbis, Alkali and Kalischer, never based their appeal for settlement on physical need. Their ideas could be regarded as modern, but lineally descended expressions of historic messianism. By 1850, a sort of messianic age opened in Russia. In 1855, Alexander II ascended the Tsarist throne and set about some domestic reform, including a more humane approach to the Jews. He did away with the 6-year pre-conscription horror of Russian Jewish life, the Jewish military cantonment. They allowed greater numbers of Jews to move into the Russian interior, to participate in local government, to attend universities and practice their professions. Most Jews responded with hope, gratitude, and self-examination. A considerable middle class was developing in Galicia, along the borderlands of the Pale of Settlement, and in Odessa. This new element was the first to react to these winds of humanism sweeping in from the West. With new opportunities opening for Jewish enterprise, the Jewish bourgeoisie urged for all the Jews in Russia to modernize and productivize themselves by moving into more useful and dignified livelihoods and freeing themselves from the restrictive lockstep of parochial Jewish education. This secular awakening is known in Jewish history as the Haskala, the mid-19th century period of East European Jewish enlightenment. The earliest of the humanists placed a new emphasis on nature and beauty, love and physical action. This change seems to have moved them more of their own accord to assimilate into Russian society. Through discourse with the surrounding Gentile population, normalcy, insight, and enrichment could be gained. There were Haskala poets and Haskala literature, which seemed to de-emphasize the traditional messianic yearning for Zion. But Jewish humanism also injected some significant mainstream features into the Zionist ideology, like, for example, the demand for vocational productivism. The literature extolled the merits of physical labor in the fields and in the factories, a conception that became the very bedrock of labor Zionism. It idealized a new secular Jew who appraised the world realistically. It also revitalized the Hebrew language. Until the 1850s, Hebrew was mainly limited to the synagogue and religious school. Yiddish was the spoken vernacular of the Eastern Jews. Now, writers of this Jewish Enlightenment revived Hebrew. They had a social motive as well, which was to separate themselves from the Yiddish-speaking proletariat. But the real reason was ethnocentric, to prevent them from just becoming Jewish Russians, like the German Salon Jews of the previous decades, but enlightened Russian Jews, aware of the values of their heritage. The secular literary use of Hebrew evoked a pattern of historical reference. Hebrew lent itself to describe in a natural way the conditions of Jewish life in terminology rich with biblical allusions, in contrast with the environment of the Russian Jewish village, with the old idealized glories of ancient Zion. Okay, so that's enough for this one for now. I just wanted to sort of review my notes and move forward from here. I mean, it's a long book. It's going to take me a while.